Kia ora koutou, Nick Cradock-Henry from Manaaki Whenua, Landcare Research. And thank you very much for inviting me out this evening. And hopefully I can sort of build on what Petra presented the other day around sort of some of the climate change that might be expected in North Canterbury. And so what I thought I would do is sort of the next sort of step really in kind of considering how to manage the impacts of climate change is how can we actually adapt, and what are the sort of decisions that we need to make? Are there different actions we can take? And we've recently completed some work up in the Hawke's Bay for the Ministry of Primary Industries, and we're going to be rolling out sort of an additional extension of that project in Canterbury over the coming months as well. So this is kind of an introduction to some of that work, and hopefully with some practical lessons. So I won't spend too much time covering Petra's ground, but really I think, as everyone sort of is aware, climate change, since the sort of 1850s, or the last 170 years or so, it has been sort of accelerating. It was interesting to read that the other day it reached 54.4 degrees in Death Valley in the United States. And they're not sure, but they think it might actually be the highest temperature recorded. There were previously high temperatures in the 30s in Iran, I think it was. But of course, there's issues around instrumentation. So we've already sort of warmed about 1.2 degrees. And probably by about 2035, if we kind of stick on the sort of current trajectories, we'll reach about 1.5 degrees, and probably sometime in the 2060s reach 2 degrees. For New Zealand, of course, this has a number of implications for those of us that live and have our livelihoods based in sort of rural regions. Of course, this will mean changes in precipitation, warmer, hotter conditions, particularly for eastern regions. It'll mean changes in the timing of certain events, frosts, the sort of changes in winds and so on. And all of these things, again, I'm sure Petra covered in some detail, and they all have sort of wide-ranging implications for the sorts of places that we value, the activities that we generate economic value from, places that hold meaning for us, and they will require some sort of change in our behavior or in the way we manage these risks. And the evidence, as I say, the evidence is overwhelming. A few years ago, some colleagues wrote a paper looking at the sort of 2012-2013 drought. And that was sort of one of the first sort of cases where they argued, actually, we are beginning to see here in New Zealand the actual sort of fingerprint of climate change. And they argued, yes, there would have been a drought that year due to El Nino, etc., but that arguably that climate change had made it worse. And then more recently, some other colleagues said that the 2017-2018 drought was actually providing a sort of a glimpse into the sorts of conditions that New Zealand might face in the future. So they argued that the heat waves that we experienced just a few years ago were actually a really good analog. They were basically analogous to the sorts of conditions we might expect in 20 or 30 years' time. So the extreme temperatures, the impacts for pasture production and so on, they actually provide a bit of a glimpse into the sort of future we might sort of be facing, and how then we might need to begin to consider adaptation options. And more locally, finally, for the last few years, Joe, my colleague over there running running the slides, we've been working up in Kaikoura. We'd started some work up there just in the months before the earthquake, funnily enough. And then following the earthquake, of course, we've been spending sort of a number of years as part of a number of different research projects. And over that time, of course, at the time of the quake in November of 2016, North Canterbury had already sort of been in drought for several years. I remember when the coming back from Kaikoura one day when it actually started to rain, and it was quite a monumental downpour. It must have been about February of 2017. But then again, we've seen just in the last 6 to 8 months, again, that North Canterbury, these conditions have sort of come back. It's been extremely dry, again, with implications for primary industries, well-being, and more. So what do we do about it? There's a couple of different sort of ways we can sort of start to think about these things, but the main sort of, first of all, of course, it's necessary to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's kind of a bit of a given. Methane, carbon dioxide, we need to reduce them, and quickly. However, there's a lot of emissions that we've already released into the atmosphere again, and so there's going to be a lag. So even if we reduce emissions to zero today, there will still be some sort of warming in the future for several decades. So we do need to make some sort of changes. We need to adapt. And to adapt not only means to sort of reduce the sorts of risks and reduce our exposure to those risks, but it can also mean, and I think this often gets lost in some of the discussions, but it's also about realizing opportunities. Are there going to be new opportunities that come with warmer temperatures, or with some of these, will some places become more suitable, and will we be able to sort of anticipate these changes proactively? And so we start to sort of think about the future, and it's a bit like, holding a flashlight. We can see, as Petra probably pointed out, we can see some way into the future with reasonable confidence. So we know that the sorts of trends we're experiencing today are probably, with some confidence, we can say, yes, for the next 5 to 10 years, we can pretty much predict how things will unfold. However, as we sort of step out 20, 30, 40 years, that kind of, again, when you think of the flashlight, that beam of light becomes dissipated and you can't see quite as far, but you do know there is something up ahead that you probably need to step over. And so that cone of uncertainty, as they sometimes refer to it, sort of widens the further out you go. But we do know within that kind of uncertainty, we know that, yes, things will get warmer, depending on the extent to which our emissions increase, decrease, or stay the same. That, of course, will influence the range of temperatures we face. So we can kind of, we have a bit of a bounding area we can sort of predict with some confidence. Then we also know, again, based on current trends, so there's been some recent work saying actually that the worst case scenario is probably we'd have to burn a lot more fossil fuels to reach that sort of 8.5 emissions scenario. So we probably aren't actually going to see the worst case scenario. But on the other hand, our most optimistic projections, we're still not reaching those at the speed we should. So we probably can kind of reduce that realm of uncertainty slightly, but we still sort of have a bit of a bounding area. And that within that, there will be, changes and variations depending on the choices we make, but we still need to plan for that sort of future. So yes, the future is uncertain. So we're dealing with considerable uncertainties, but we still need to ask what's going to happen and when. And it's a question of sort of not doing, not too much, not too little, not too early, not too late. And how do we sort of make decisions when we know, when we have a limited sort of vision about the future, when we know with some things with some confidence, but we're still, things might change. So in recent years, there's been quite a bit of work looking at how we actually make decisions when faced with uncertainty. And a number of sort of different approaches have been sort of proposed and tested. And about 7 or 8 years ago, there was they started to make some pretty significant infrastructure investments. So a lot of this work was originally done in the UK and the Netherlands, where, of course, in the Netherlands, they have significant issues with sea level rise and perpetual flooding. And the sorts of infrastructure decisions that they were making came with extremely long lead times. So they were considering making infrastructure investments for flood protection that were trying to look at 100 years into the future and needing to make those decisions with some confidence because they were investing millions of euros. But at the same time, they needed those investments to be reasonably flexible. So they needed to be able to change those investments. They needed to be able to modify and adapt those structures if things actually got worse than they'd expected. And so they started to develop some processes and some tools on how you actually make decisions when faced with uncertainty. And of course, the work that they started to do was extremely expensive. So they're running massive simulations because they're making multi-million euro investment decisions. And so they develop these sort of pathways which represent, so I've just thrown one up here. Essentially, this is kind of a map to the future in terms of how they make decisions under different scenarios. And each of those little circles represents kind of a point at which you make a decision to invest or not invest, to build something. All of those have a lifespan, and so it all gets very messy and complex. And in New Zealand, some of this work has been sort of adapted and used particularly for coastal hazards. So a couple of years ago, MFE, you might have come across the guidance on coastal hazards and climate change. So a lot of that recommendations in the MFE guidance was based on this work from the Netherlands. So DAP, or Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathways, is the process that central government has recommended councils use when making decisions about how to manage coastal hazards and sea level rise. But again, the coastal sort of setting is quite different than sort of making decisions about how to adapt in sort of regional, rural settings. Second, so next slide, sorry. So of course, in a coastal setting, you're dealing with sea level rise and coastal erosion. You've got essentially a single stressor that's driven primarily by the climate. There's a limited number of stakeholders. So you have local residents, of course, living at coastal margins. You might have infrastructure, but for the most part, those decisions are mandated, and the responsibility for managing that falls to regional councils. When you look to sort of rural communities or primary industries or rural regions more generally, you have a lot of different challenges, and they aren't all climate related. So you've got economic development, social well-being. You've got the climate risks, droughts and floods and snowstorms. You've got challenges around just pre-existing hazards, landslides, debris flows, things like that. You've got lots and lots of different stakeholders. Tangata whenua, you've got individual households, primary industries. You might have the wine industry, you might have dairy, you might have sheep and beef farming, all of which might have very different priorities around water management, around land use change. Next one. Sorry. There's really, I've said there's no one in charge, but there's lots of people in charge because everyone has a vested interest and everyone has a stake in those decisions. But the sort of, unlike in a coastal setting, the buck doesn't actually stop with one person or with one agency. Instead, there's lots of decisions that need to be made, and those responsibility for those decisions tends to be much more dispersed. And all of those decisions come with benefits. Some of them come with trade-offs. They all come with consequences. The other thing is that, so there has been some work in applying these pathways processes in New Zealand. So probably the best known example is some work that's been done up in Hawke's Bay for about an 18-kilometer stretch, if you know Hawke's Bay at all, between Tongaio and Clifton. So it's about 18 kilometers. And that process itself, that one 18-kilometer stretch, was several millions worth of dollars went into that. So when you try to replicate those sorts of processes across vulnerable communities or across rural regions, there's a significant issue with how do you scale that up? How do you actually collect the data? So what we've been trying to do then is actually, well, how can we take some of those principles? How can we take kind of the basic idea around adaptive management, around planning, around learning, around flexible decision making, and actually use it in a way that's reasonably cost effective, that's participatory, that actually involves local communities and that involves stakeholders, and that's empowering. So rather than sort of relegating the decision about the future to central government or to a local government, the decision and the learning and the process is actually shared amongst the community. And so what we've been doing is, with some funding from the Ministry for Primary Industries, we were able to essentially develop a process that we then rolled out in Hawke's Bay, which I'll talk about in a moment. But essentially what it was sort of adaptive management, which is essentially refers to kind of rather than sort of assuming that management is a linear process, that there's some sort of fixed outcome that we predetermine, and then we kind of take steps towards that. Adaptive management is much more sort of reflexive. So we make a decision, we evaluate it. Did it work? Yes, no. Would we change it? We revisit it. We're constantly monitoring and reviewing. It's iterative, it's flexible, and there's an emphasis on learning and creativity and participation. So the context that we were working in, again, is very different than sort of a coastal environment. So if you know sort of Hawke's Bay at all, similar sorts of issues you would find in North Canterbury. Yes, there's climate change and climate risks, but there's also, there's significant land use changes in that area. In the northern parts of Hawke's Bay, which is traditionally sheep and beef farming, there's, bit more forestry now and sort of land use conversions. And then on some of the sort of flatter, higher sort of value land, particularly around central Hawke's Bay, you've got arable farming, you've got vegetable cropping, you've got wine, you've got lifestyle blocks that are growing, you've got urbanization. There's also changing demands around water. Of course, huge issue in Canterbury. How do we manage water resources in a changing climate? As well as sort of rapidly changing social conditions and economic conditions. You've got within that same region, you have places like Havelock North to places like Waipukurau and Napier. So you have, vast socioeconomic disparities and inequalities, which again, influence community well-being, social cohesion, have all sorts of impacts and implications for planning for the future as well. So what we were interested in was really around understanding what's actually going to change, and can we develop strategies that are sort of going to be robust? So will they actually work regardless of how the future unfolds? So yes, while we know that the future will sort of become warmer, drier, hotter, more extreme events, the actual magnitude of those things we can't predict with enough accuracy to make decisions now, but we can still understand the broad sort of implications for biophysical systems. And so what are the sort of the tipping points in the biophysical system? Are there kind of social and economic conditions? So will there be changes in social and economic, will the sort of, a changing population, will the changing demographics of New Zealand, will the sort of in or out migration from Hawke's Bay make a difference? And when do we actually need to start making these decisions? So when do we actually need to start changing land use, or when do we need to start investing in water storage or something like that? So the sort of process that we developed then, again, was based on this idea of adaptive management. And so we kind of, the basics of it was that we wanted to start with understanding what the community wanted. So what was the objective? What were the things that people valued, and what sort of a future did they actually want to see? So if you remember back to that sort of flashlight diagram, you have the kind of the possible future, the plausible future, and then you actually, within that, you have a preferred future. So what does that future look like? I mean, did everyone want to see, the entire Hawke's Bay covered in trees and no sheep and beef, and it just become forested? Did people want to see clean rivers and a diverse agricultural economy with vibrant communities? It was up to them to decide rather than for us to tell them. Secondly, what's the current situation? So where were we at now? What was the sort of, what were the main land uses? What were the issues that people were concerned about? And then the third one was to sort of, the third step was to develop some sort of picture of the future. So how can we collectively use science, art, all of the tools that we have to create some sort of preferred and plausible visions of the future? And then can we look at what sorts of adaptations might be required to get to that future? And then the final step, of course, is, all right, well then how do we actually sort of roll that out and implement that? So that was kind of the general sort of process that we came up with. And so to kind of set the scene, yep, that's fine. You can go back one.
Oh, no,
There we go. All right. So what we did was rather than begin by kind of covering the whole of the Hawke's Bay, we actually decided to kind of take kind of two ends of a spectrum. So we identified two different catchments within the Hawke's Bay. So again, if you don't know the area, so Wairoa is kind of northern Hawke's Bay, steep hill country, quite erodible soils, mostly sheep and beef farming with some forestry. The communities up there would be places like Waipukurau, so a high proportion of Maori, relatively socioeconomically deprived in terms of income, health outcomes, education opportunities, and so on. The other catchment was basically central Hawke's Bay, so Karamu, the Tutaikuri, Ahuriri, and Nahororo rivers, where you've got, again, high value horticulture and viticulture, some arable and cropping land, and that's where sort of most of the population lives as well. So on the one hand, you've got kind of a fairly diverse sort of set of land uses in Karamu, and then up in places like Wairoa, relatively concentrated. Oh, that's perfect. So we started with understanding, all right, well, who holds a stake? We often throw the word stakeholders and community around, but actually, someone pointed, stakeholders simply refers to people that have a stake. They have a vested interest in the issue. And so we started by identifying who the actual stakeholders were. And often when climate change sort of adaptation issues get brought up, there's kind of the usual suspects. It's often MFE, MPI, and some scientists, and maybe Beef and Lamb, or Dairy New Zealand. But we actually started to try to actually encourage a slightly broader representation. So we ended up with, yes, the sort of the usual Hawke's Bay Regional Council, Hastings District Council, but we had ASB, we had ANZ, we had local iwi, we had community groups, we had Fire and Emergency New Zealand, we had different primary industry representatives. So we had students come along to the workshops. So we actually tried to get a broad coalition of interests and people that wouldn't normally sort of collect around or coalesce around an issue. And we got them, so we had a very sort of diverse group. And we started with actually just getting them to sit down in groups that they sort of self-selected and actually sort of draw what the landscape looked like to them. So some of them, as you'll see, took so the Maori group had a sort of a Mataranga Maori perspective. There was a group of rural bankers that had sort of a very very crisply drawn sort of diagram that showed stocks and flows of different things. Others sort of drew some drew a waka, some drew trees and hills, but they all started to sort of begin to identify the elements of the landscape that were really important to them. And so some of the things that they started to identify, they actually began to realize that, yes, that this was not just about climate risks, that there was all sorts of things that were related that meant a lot to them and that would be affected by climate change, but that they wanted to see valued. So, so some people talked about having a vibrant regional economy. Again, places like Waipukurau, relatively socioeconomically depressed. There's few job opportunities. It's the road. At the time, there was the railway line had basically been disused. The one road in and out was frequently washed out due to landslides. So they wanted to see the sort of a vibrant economy. They wanted to see more jobs for young people. Other people, they really wanted lots of conversations about fresh water, natural capital. Of course, they wanted to see, extract more value from the primary industries. We don't want to just ship raw logs off to Asia. We actually want to capture some additional value. And so we ended up bringing together these diverse people, and they identified sort of 4 key issues that they wanted to work on. So they did. They wanted to see sort of primary industries that were able to sort of adapt and were resilient to the future. They wanted to ensure that there was sufficient security of supply for water and that there was fresh water quality as well. They wanted to ensure that processing and production infrastructure was resilient and was able to cope with future change. And they really wanted to see vibrant, resilient communities. So then we kind of said, all right, well, that's sort of your aspiration for the future. So then we kind of looked at, all right, well, what's the current situation? So again, we kind of used some of the sort of tools that we have as researchers, and we kind of started to map out with them what the system looked like. So how do things interact? How does a vibrant primary industry, for example, which is the one I've thrown up here. So how does a sort of a resilient primary sector, what are the things that influence that? So a resilient primary industry, of course, is based on available land. It's based on available water. You've got the human capital, so the skills necessary to make those to add the value. You've got physical capital, built infrastructure, irrigation systems. You've got market demands. And again, we sort of started to build up a picture with the community of how all of these things interact, and then to start to identify, all right, where does climate then influence these things? And then in turn, how can we start to identify how to adapt in that sense as well? So once we once we had a shared understanding of what the big issues were, once we kind of had developed a better understanding of what the system looked like, of how everything was related, we then started to look at, all right, what does the future look like? And again, as Petra probably discussed, there's essentially, when we kind of come up with, when we develop projections and scenarios for the future, for future temperature change and precipitation change, those are all, of course, contingent on, greenhouse gas emissions. They're also contingent on things that happen essentially beyond New Zealand's control. So, we are a very small percentage of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So most of the emissions come from the US, China, Brazil. And so even if New Zealand does its part, we're still sort of largely subject to what happens elsewhere. Furthermore, those changes in greenhouse gas emissions are going to be a function of global population growth. They're going to be a function of how rapidly technology develops. Can we actually develop things like carbon sequestration? Can we devise alternatives to fossil fuels? All sorts of things start to come into play, all of which will affect whether or not we see 4 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So rather than sort of overwhelm everybody with the complexity of 5 different scenarios for emissions and 4 different scenarios for population growth, we just decided, actually, we'll try and keep this relatively simple with, here's a best or better case in terms of emissions and temperature change, and here's sort of a business as usual case. So we developed some information around, we took the NIWA climate projections, and we produced sort of little fact sheets. And then we developed, over on the right, we looked at all of the social and economic trends. So we looked at population growth in the Hawke's Bay, and we took some of the Stats NZ data to look at, what are the population trends out to 2050 and 2100? Are there sort of advances in technology, and how quickly will those come online? We looked at land use change. So we were actually able to start to develop again, we presented all of this, and we had expert working groups that helped us with this as well. And then, of course, we looked at more conventional measures like potential changes in evapotranspiration and so on. And then we presented this back to the community, and they asked, all right, well, can you also give us some additional information around some of the more specific climate variables? So we then did a bit more modeling. And, we produced maps of changes in extreme hot days. So, days over 30 degrees, the number of growing degree days, winter chilling hours, again, for things like kiwi fruit are important, frost days. So we were actually able to then start to, again, use these in quite a meaningful way to start to build up a bit of a picture about what the future might look like. Next slide. And we also started to use some more creative and artistic ways of representing the future. Again, we had a lot of, and we have community groups, for example, that want to engage with schools or with students. And so gridded, some sort of a GIS product or geospatial modeling isn't going to be as engaging as a drawing. And so we're starting some more work up in the same region. So on the left, you've got basically, the region under a sort of a high emission scenario, where you've got, increased sort of landslides and debris flows, the port, the primary industries aren't as productive, and so the port's, sort of seen a bit of a decline. There's, the waterways are, in some cases, there's a bit more runoff because there's more frequent rain events. Whereas in a sort of a better case scenario where we've got slightly lower emissions, but we're also trying to adapt more. We fenced off waterways. There's a bit of, we're capturing more value from the primary industries. Of course, the hills are greener and so on. And so we can use these sorts of images to start to think about and help people imagine what the future might look like, and then what sorts of decisions, what sorts of actions might they need to take in order to realize that. So what we then did is, if you remember that very colorful drawing from the Netherlands, where they basically showed the sorts of options that they were going to take in order to manage flood risk in the Netherlands, we tried to take those same concepts but produce something that was a bit more accessible and a bit more legible. So essentially what we did is we said, all right, well, we know what the situation is now, and you've all decided where you would like to be sort of in the next 100 years. And then what we do is we then kind of looked at, all right, what are the sorts of management practices? What are the adaptations that you need to take? Well, you can stick with current practices because that will actually probably get you through the next 10 years given current trends. You might want to start looking at irrigation efficiencies, installing low flow irrigation systems, but of course that comes with a cost, so you might want to weigh that out and calculate that. You might want to sort of look at changing to drought-tolerant species like lucerne, and then sort of over the longer term, you might want to start looking at more significant land use change, breeding for heat tolerance if you have dairy cows, or shifting to sort of new modes of production. So then, so if you stick with current practice, so again, rather than sort of trying to overcomplicate things, we just kind of stuck with a much more simple sort of design. So if you stick with current practice, yes, that'll probably take you out sort of 10 years. And then the gray bar signifies that things become kind of a bit more marginal if you just kind of were sticking with your current practice. And that you might then want to, irrigation efficiencies is actually probably something you want to start looking at now, even if you don't actually implement it for another 5 years or so. You're at least sort of laying the groundwork. And the same with some of those sort of more transformational changes, which again might require significant investment and have a longer sort of a lifespan. And then the idea was, that you can sort of pick and choose and sort of navigate your way through that. So that's what the yellow line is. So that was kind of the basic idea and the concept that we were working with. So again, we basically started in a sort of a very low-tech sort of a way, where we basically had large sheets of paper, and as a group we would sort of go through, what are we doing now? What are the options that are available right now that we can start implementing? What are sorts of things that we might want to implement in the future or sort of later? and then what are the sort of things we might want to implement much later. So essentially what we did is we took everything that people had written out. We then drew it up on big sheets of, I guess that's A3 or I don't know, A4, big sheets of sort of poster-sized sheets of paper, and then we brought them back to the community, and then they voted on which options they liked the best. They added new options. They took some options away, and then we redid them, and ended up with sort of final sort of pathways for their different priorities. So if you remember from the beginning that there was sort of several issues that they wanted to see in terms of outcomes for the community. So they really wanted to see sort of community resilience and well-being. So the key decision that they came up with was how can community resilience and well-being be enhanced and maintained in the face of environmental change, social and economic inequality, and urbanization. And they decided actually that you could basically not make any changes, but that no changes would only take them for about 10 years. But they decided that there was a number of sort of low or no cost things that they could do. So they could start to engage the community on adaptation. They wanted to see tikanga Maori, or Mataranga Maori, and Maori heritage become more prominent as part of their planning. They wanted to sort of identify new job opportunities. So there's EIT, the Educational Centre up there, but they thought as well that council could, start identifying, where the sort of future research or where the future jobs would be. They wanted to see sort of, improved rail links and, what are the assets that continue to community resilience and well-being. So there was a number of things that they figured that they could actually do right now, that they didn't need to wait 10 years, but there were things that they could do right now. And of course, there were other things like constructing multi-use indoor facilities that probably they needed, if it was going to get a lot hotter and people were going to need new recreational facilities. Yeah, that was probably still 30 years away, but it was good to flag that anyway. The same with infrastructure. So there was, there was work that they could do now. So what will the infrastructure needs look like in the future? Can we sort of assess the vulnerability of local supply chains? So again, for places like Wairoa or Waipukurau, where the road gets washed out, the fact that the road gets washed out so often means that it's very difficult if you are trying to plant avocados in Waipukurau. You probably wouldn't consider it as an attractive investment because you couldn't be assured that the trucks will be able to run your avocados to the port when needed. So again, there was they decided that actually just simply assessing the infrastructure needs and opportunities was going to be important. Oh, you can go back one. Water, again, was a key issue for them. So how does the Hawke's Bay maintain that security of supply into the future? And again, so you can improve water management. You can just, educate people about the needs for realizing water efficiencies. You can manage soil carbon. You can invest in irrigation efficiencies. You can start looking at global water sharing agreements. You can look at on-farm and on-orchard farm reticulation. And you can sort of, much longer into the future, you might actually sort of start to consider, whether or not sort of desalinization or aquifer recharge, things that might still be 50 years or 100 years away, but that they might be things that you might need to consider if you were going to get more droughts and you were still wanting to have a vibrant regional economy in terms of the primary industries. And then, of course, because our primary, we were doing this work for MPI, of course, there was a lot of interest in understanding what sorts of management practices could be done at a farm level. And again, you can kind of stick with the business as usual, or if you were a dairy farmer or a sheep and beef farmer, you might look at stocking rates and adjusting stocking rates and having flexible stocking rates in order to accommodate variability in terms of the weather. It might mean sort of adjusting timing in terms of lambing or calving, again, in order to sort of, adjust in response to the weather. Again, in this area, there was a lot of interest in covered production systems, particularly for vegetable farmers, considering, the likelihood of more extreme weather events, frosts or hail, and so whether those covered systems would actually be cost effective in the long run. Do you actually start to transition to novel land uses? So again, we had a presentation, so they wanted to hear about what sorts of things could be grown in Hawke's Bay. And it turns out that Waipukurau was actually really quite well suited to macadamia nuts. But of course, you need to invest into that. That's a significant investment. You'd need to invest in processing facilities, but it could also have sort of economic benefits and so on. So all these sorts of opportunities, so it ended up being about much more than climate change, and it actually became, a lot of the conversations ended up being about regional economic development, community, and so on. And then what we did is we kind of had done these exercises in the two communities, and then we brought everyone together to actually look at what might be required across the Hawke's Bay more generally. So how do we kind of aggregate these things up? And again, so we kind of came up with this, or they came up with this short list of adaptation options, which was really kind of focused around strategic planning. So how do we actually start to incorporate some of these considerations into sort of things like the long-term plan? How do we promote learning opportunities? So how do we engage schools on these things? How do we engage the community on understanding these sorts of opportunities? And then, of course, changing management practices over the long term. And they kind of decided actually, well, some of these things were incremental. Some of these things, again, they were sort of changes that you can make over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, that they get you kind of part of the way. And that there was going to be some sort of transitional period as well, where you do start to sort of either shift towards a lower carbon footprint or a lower water footprint, and that those transitional activities, again, those might be 10, 20, 30 years away. And then finally, that there may also be sort of transformational changes that would be required. Those sorts of changes that require significant investment or a significant commitment of resource or of energy or of time, but that really do change in a radical way the sorts of systems that you operate and the sorts of things that you, and the sorts of outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And there are no easy answers. I've used this quote from a winemaker in Hawke's Bay who was involved in this project and has been involved in other work. And he makes a really good point, that climate change, as he says, it's a double-edged sword for the wine industry. On the one hand, it'll make growing certain grape varietals easier, but on the other hand, there's a quid pro quo. There's trade-offs and synergies. And of course, as he points out as well, it's not just climate change. You've got, community concerns about irrigation, about, water allocation. And so there are no easy answers, and it is complex, and it's much more than just change in temperature or change in precipitation. But I think the thing that we learned, and the thing that we really kind of wanted to stress, and the thing that hopefully the community sort of realized, was that yes, there's a lot we can do now. We don't necessarily need to wait another 5 years or another 10 years, that there are things we can do now. And this evening is a great example, in this series of talks that Anita and Petra have done are a great example of things that we're doing now, that we can begin now despite the uncertainty. And that, impacts will be felt in a lot of different ways across a lot of different elements and a lot of different places and a lot of different things that we value. And that there's no right answer. There's no silver bullet. rather there's sort of, sometimes it's referred to as a cloudburst approach. There's no one way. Rather, we actually need to have lots of different strategies and lots of different options. And that, yes, best practice is admirable and desirable, and we should adopt it as much as we can. But that will only get us so far, and that we probably will need to start thinking about and planning about some other changes, some bigger, more transformational changes that may be required. And the approach that we took, it was a first go for us as a team, and it was extremely useful. But of course, it had its limitations. But we sort of found that it was useful enough, and that it did sort of achieve a number of benefits, not only for the community, but for our funders as well. And that essential and probably the biggest takeaway for us was that the community participation and the stakeholder involvement in the process, that made all of the difference. That the involving people in the planning, in the scoping of the future, in terms of building capability and capacity, we had people who weren't familiar with climate modeling before the workshops. So we ran about 5 workshops over the course of the 2 years of the project, where each of the community groups came together. So people started to learn about climate modeling. They built relationships with each other. They started to feel empowered about decision making, and they felt that their local values and their priorities were being considered. So it was sort of a participatory process, and that they could see some ways forward. So the work itself, so we finished the project up the end of 2019, and there is actually a final report, as well as one paper's already out, and there's another paper that's just in review. And we published as well a short sort of policy brief, which is just a short 2-sided thing. But then about a month ago, we proposed a second phase of the project to MPI. And essentially what we wanted to do was we wanted to take the initial process that we'd done in the Hawke's Bay and roll it out to other regions. And we were successful in that. And so beginning in October, we're working with Environment Canterbury, and we'll be sort of doing a similar process in Canterbury as well. So we've got Canterbury, Marlborough, and Northland are the next 3 locations for this particular project. And so hopefully there'll be an opportunity for those of you that are interested in the future to get involved in that as well. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions or points that people would like to make to Nick?
Yes, I was just wondering, so when you're dealing with a very large area, which is Canterbury has been defined now as, somewhere north here, all the way down to the Waitaki bank. I mean, do you break it up into subsections like you did with the 2?
Yeah, we'll have more than 2 because there's just there's much more variation here. Yeah. So we're working with Morag Butler on that, on how we actually sort of break it up into different zones. Because I think the main thing is that we want to get a sufficient representation from across sort of the range of landscapes and also the range of issues that people face. Yeah.
We're very fortunate tonight because we've got 2 local mayors here tonight. We've got the mayor of Hurunui, Murray Black, and we've also got the mayor of Waimak, Dan and Gordon. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think we should thank them both for taking the time and trouble.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah? Yes.
It seems that climate change is like COVID. You can't deal with it as an individual. It's a population or community thing. And one of the ways that New Zealand has been relatively successful is that we've responded as a community, as a team of 5 million, rather than as a bunch of individuals. And I'm sure that adapting to climate change will require, again, a community or population, societal response. We can't deal with it by a few people buying electric cars.
Absolutely.
And so, and also, because there's going to be change, there will be loss. And some of the crops that we used to be able to grow, or the things that we used to be able to do, we will lose. And so that's quite a difficult thing. There'll be a bit of grieving. And so community leadership from our community leaders is terrifically important. And I think what you've done tonight is shown us that actually by bringing people together in a room with different interests and stakes to talk about climate change, they can actually end up with something really positive, which is building a shared picture about the sort of things they want to see happening in that community in the future. And so hopefully that's will be taken on board.
Can I ask a question? It sounds like a really interesting process, and it sounds like people went through it and changed views, maybe saw common things that they didn't expect from each other, perhaps. But that was mainly in relation to adaptation as they went through the process. Do you think there were some changes in their views on mitigation as a consequence of realising the changes that they were likely to face?
It's probably a greater, it'd be difficult to say. I've kind of been, I remember when going back probably getting on for 15 years now, when, at the time when New Zealand was sort of flirting with the idea of a carbon tax, and it was sort of reframed as the fart tax, and, you talk to farmers and it was immediately, you wouldn't get anywhere if you talked about climate change because it was all about, they immediately associated that with sort of methane emissions and the government taxing them and so on. I think what changed probably what I found has changed over the last 15 years or so is that there's greater awareness already around mitigation, that people have seen enough change in their own lifetime in terms of the weather, in terms of the warmer days, warmer nights, etc., that they realize that something has changed. And so in a way, we were starting from a reasonably good understanding, or a shared understanding that this was an issue. Yeah, I think we we didn't really touch on the mitigation side of things, because often what we found in previous workshops is that then it's quite difficult to manage when you've got a very diverse group. It's difficult to then manage, or it's difficult to prevent it from falling into a quite conflict. Conflict, where people start to take positions, everything becomes entrenched, and then you can't actually have that kind of free, open discussion that is really essential to actually, So by framing it around adaptation, all right, we know there's a problem, we know we need to do something, but what do we want to see? How can we achieve that? It was a way to try to step it out beyond that. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered the question, but yeah.
When you're working with a group of people, what were the tips or techniques that you might have used to actually get people to work at a steady and considered pace? Because I'm guessing that probably some people wanted to go fast and some wanted to go slow. And how did you get people to kind of collaborate in the thinking process?
Yeah, it's interesting because so we'd actually done some previous work in Hawke's Bay, and I remember this well. So we were involved in, I don't know if you've come across the tank process, which was, again, it was a collaborative process to try to reach agreement among diverse stakeholders around freshwater allocation and takes from four catchments. And I remember the first meeting we had, one of the farmers actually stood up and said, "Look, I can tell you I can save us all a lot of work and time and effort and energy. And, it needs to be, X QMX at this point, and that's, I know what the limit is already. And we were all, okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We're still going to go through the process and see if we can all agree that might well be where we get to. We might get to 1,300 QMEX at that point, or we might actually decide that it's more like 1,500 or 2,000. And so with this particular, so we've tried to take some of the experiences that we've had from that sort of process and bring it into this adaptation work. And I suppose what we found was actually, first of all, we tried to begin, again, the way we did it differently this time was we started with basically getting them, we kind of went in there with much more of an open book and a blank sheet. So we, of course, we kind of set up some basically terms of reference for the group. And we said, look, we're not a consultancy. Yes, we have research questions, but we're actually, we're here essentially as a facilitation exercise. We're trying to, we have knowledge, we have a certain set of skills, and we have resources that we can bring to bear. But really, I've been to the Hawke's Bay, but I don't know the Hawke's Bay. I don't know the issues here. You do. So we started from that place of really letting them set the agenda in a way. So again, the first workshop was basically just getting them to work in groups to just, draw the landscape. And that was basically what we told them to do was just, here's a big sheet of post paper and some colored pens. What does the landscape mean to you? What does it look like? And so as researchers, that meant, ceding some control and being, ourselves as researchers becoming comfortable with a bit of uncertainty. And for the group, it gave them a chance to actually start talk together or speak, work together, start developing that collective vision. And we essentially, the way we ran it then was that the group set the agenda. So we probably would have got through things faster if we'd gone, all right, we've got, half an hour for this exercise, but we tried really to kind of let them set the pace, yeah. And interestingly, with the tank process, again, when this dairy farmer stood up and said, I can save us all a lot of time, I think it still took nearly 5 years before we actually got all 30 plus people around the table to agree what the limit was. So.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I've got 2 questions here. First of all, have you been monitoring and what have you observed in the way of number of people that have actually started adaptation pathways and are they moving as you expect?
Yeah.
And then secondly, what's the affirmation and support processes that actually support them within the community?
Yeah, so we were partnered with Hawke's Bay Regional Council. So they provided some funding and some contribution to the process. And so they've taken, so they're doing our pathways process. That is part of the challenge, is that as researchers, we are contracted to basically deliver the pathways, and then it was up to the community to actually implement things. So there has been, so Hawke's Bay Regional Council has been supporting community groups. So there's a local group up in Waipukurau that's trying to develop some of the opportunities, particularly around the regional economic development. I think the biggest impact of the work has been that the MPI has seen the value of the work and is supporting us to scale it out across other regions. So they do see, there is recognition that it is a valuable tool in the process. So it's been used, as I say, for coastal hazards in Hawke's Bay, and then ours is now going to be rolled out elsewhere. In terms of monitoring success, it's something that we want to do. We want to go back to the community as part of this next project to actually kind of, again, we've done this with the collaborative group that we ran for the water management, where we went back after the fact, and basically with that it was much easier because it became a statutory obligation, and there was a consenting process. And whereas with this, local council needs to run with it, community groups need to run with it, but we still want to evaluate and see. Yeah, we did do an evaluation, and so again, we kind of collected feedback on sort of the extent to which people had learned from the process, as well as the extent to which people had developed new relationships, and any sort of had people sort of had their values and priorities changed as a result of the process. And yeah, all of those things showed that they had. So
the mechanisms for support and affirmation, are they there in the community? You can make a lot of decisions about what you want to do.
Yep.
But there does actually have to be a whole culture and structure that help you do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a challenge as researchers. We don't have the power to do that. That's where we have to partner with other institutions like local government, schools, to facilitate that. So yeah.
I
was just wondering if you'd picked up on what people were placing most value on, whether it was people wanting to do what they do, the way they do it, in which case they may have to look at shifting.
Yep.
Or was it people wanting to live where they live, in which case they might have to change what they do?
Yep. It was people wanting to live where they live, and that they were willing to change whatever needed to be changed in order to maintain their identity. Yeah. So there was, so this was a really prevalent issue, particularly in parts of northern Hawke's Bay, where you had multi-generation sheep and beef farmers. Their great-great-great-grandparents had cleared the land. They weren't going to, plant. They weren't going to be the ones that planted trees back, but they still wanted to figure out how could they stay on that land. Yeah. So.
Anything else?
So it's all about an overlapping personal responsibility to the land, to your family, like you're talking about history, and financial, so you can keep trucking, and then that whole sort of social and environmental and future responsibility. How could you actually see the people who had the power to do things giving up some of their personal sort of, asset or privilege or whatever to be able to ensure the social responsibility and environmental factors were long longevity?
Yeah, because again, it's very similar to the sort of process that we did. So our project ran for about, we had 2 years of funding for the project. The tank process, again, it was a 5-year process. And at the end of that 5-year process, some of the biggest advocates for the series of recommendations that Hawke's Bay Regional Council adopted, which again were around water takes, water allocation, was the dairy farmer that stood up saying, I know what the answer is. Because over the course of those 5 years, everyone had learned to give and take a bit. So to paint with a very broad brush, some of the community groups and some of the tangata whenua realized that in order to have a vibrant community, they still needed economic activity. So, like it or not, there was still going to be some dairy farming, there was still going to be some arable, but the arable growers realized, okay, well, yes, I still want my kids and your kids to be able to enjoy clean rivers and swim. So I'll let go of a bit. So but it was the process of actually going through, over a very lengthy, period of time of developing what because there were actually things that everybody agreed on. Everybody agreed that they wanted clean rivers. Everybody agreed they wanted, a healthy economy, et cetera, et cetera. So then it was just, all right, well, that's what you all agree on. So how do we get there? So I think that with the process that we went through, I think that we've started that. I think that the workshops, people were able to develop that collective vision and begin to identify some of the ways in which they might, have to give a bit, take a bit, in order to achieve that. And then there's the implementation. So how do you actually design institutions? How do you design incentives to actually realize those things? But I do think that it's doable, but it does involve bringing people together to explore that collectively rather than individually, which is, often what happens is that these things get done on a sector level. So dairy farmers will get together and decide, yep, we need more irrigation. But that decision is made in isolation. Viticulture, horticulture, arable, bringing everybody together is the only way to do it, I think. Yeah. So.
Sounds intergenerational.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The same people in the seat, usually.
Yeah.
But within the regions, were they thinking about like feeding the region? Like, were they thinking about a balance of what they would need to?
Yep.
If were they so they could feed themselves?
Yeah.
Effectively?
Yeah. So one of the things that they wanted to look at was to develop a plan around the circular economy. So they were very much thinking about, all right, well, maybe we can develop biogas, we can develop, things like that, and actually sort of, take a much more holistic vision of the region. Yeah.
So they were building global breakdown into the thinking.
Yep.
I was just wondering, the New Zealand climate change risk assessment that
Yeah.
has just come out, is there anything that you've done in terms of the work that's been done there? Do you get a sense there's a greater urgency to have these conversations?
Yes.
More widespread?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that is, so the National Adaptation Plan, so the risk assessment, has been done. And the National Adaptation Plan, the first National Adaptation Plan is about 2 years away. But yeah, I know, I could talk about the National Risk Assessment, but I won't.
Is ECAN up for this?
Yeah, ECAN's been great. Yeah. So
electorality rather than just sort of.
yes. Yeah. So they actually did the So before the national risk assessment, ECAN actually ran an internal process to do this, and yeah, they've been very supportive of this. Tim Davies and Morag Butler in particular. Yeah.
Should I say it was a ECAN councillor that asked that question?
Yeah. Just to say that in terms of our strategic direction for our current long-term plan, climate change is across everything.
Yep.
Everything that we're doing. So we're onto it.
Yeah, I ran into Daniel at the coffee shop the other day. So.
Considering the adaptation pathway, for the Wairoa area, I worked in the Wairoa discount store when I was a student. They're all that hill country.
Yeah.
So extensive hill
Yeah.
country, multi-generational. What sort of adaptation would they have to apply for that sort of beef and sheep farm?
Yeah. So again, that was when we kind of started looking at novel land uses. So, none of them wanted to go back to, none of them wanted to, plant trees. So, but at the same time, they needed to manage soil erosion. So it came down to lower stocking rates, and then, adding something like hops or macadamias or some sort of other land use. Yeah. Yeah. So.
So when you were designing the groups for this research, how did you come to the conclusion of who were stakeholders who should be included in the focus groups?
Oh, we had a lot of help from regional council. I've been working in Hawke's Bay for quite a while. We had so we'd been involved in this water group. It was a lot of conversations. Yeah, just we probably spent about 3 months just basically doing an inventory, stakeholder mapping exercise to identify who needed to be there in the room, and the group grew from that. So it was combination then of, I suppose, like a formal mapping exercise, conversations with key people at HBRC, and then also, our own networks as a team of researchers. So we had, so it was Landcare led the project. We also had NIWA, Plant and Food Research, Hawke's Bay Regional Council, MPI, Apples and Pears New Zealand, Dairy New Zealand. So basically we contacted everybody and said, who needs to be there? Yeah. So.
Really exciting.
Yeah, thanks. I've really enjoyed. Yeah, it was a very rewarding bit of work. Yeah, and really pleased that we have an opportunity to extend it a bit more. So.
It's good to hear practice run before you
I find it fascinating that you don't address mitigation at all, because like for those beef and sheep farmers in the Wairoa Hill Country, if you also, because they're going to have to address mitigation within 5 years.
Yep.
And so if they were to think about some tree planting to mitigate the offsets from their beef farming and sheep farming, then it can be put into that.
Yeah.
But you're
well, we have
adaptation.
I've got another project at the moment where we are trying to incorporate that a bit more.
Yeah.
So we're working in on the West Coast, and then the other working with Ag Research on that one.
Because to me, it just as bizarre as this, stream plantings that's going on, where to destock a waterway and you have to plant it, but they're planting with heaps of monocots with no carbon. If you plant it with something that sequesters carbon, you're killing two birds with one stone. So it's on these single purposes. Very difficult. I know science likes them.
Anything else? Well, I think we're fortunate tonight because we've got 2 local councillors, we've got an ECAN councillor and 2 mayors. So we've got people of influence here. The idea can take root.
Yes.
Traditionally, Nick, we give our speakers a cake and a bottle of wine. Your cake is here in a box that was made by the maker of the cake. Your wine is here.
Oh, tremendous. Thank you very much.
If there aren't any more questions, thanks very much. And thanks.
My pleasure.
Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.